you very much, Leslie. I'm afraid you're going to get lots of slides this morning. That's the penalty of nuts and webinars. Anyway, so this has been very much a year of anniversary so far as Scotland's governance is concerned. It's 25 years anniversary of the foundation of the Scottish Parliament, which first met on officially on the 1st of July 1999, and then secondly, of course, an anniversary that's coming up later this month, which is the 10th anniversary of the independence referendum. So we thought we'd mark this occasion by looking, yes, to some degree at what's happened over the last 25 years, but then focusing in particular on the last 10 years, and within that, focusing in particular on the way in which Brexit has and has not changed the character and distribution of attitudes towards independence north of the border. So anyway, to begin with, let's just take the long view of 25 years of attitudes towards how Scotland's governed. This is the longest time series that we've got on the subject. It's a question that was crafted in the 1990s, and it reveals its age to some degree. But essentially, it asks people to choose between three options. One is Scotland should be independent, separate from the rest of the UK. And then there's a question, they then get asked separately, is that inside or outside the EU? But we're lumping together those who say Scotland should be independent. That is what I would call a purple line. We then got, Scotland should have its own parliament, but within the framework of the UK, with or without taxation powers. And that's the red line. And then you've got, which is our green line, those who say, no, we shouldn't have a parliament at all. Now, that never was a particularly popular view by the time the late 1990s, and it continues not to be a particularly popular view. What you will see, however, has changed on this long-term measure, which I should say, we're not measuring here directly how people would vote in a referendum, but the advantage of this is that we can take the long view. Until the independence referendum, basically, it was very rare for Scottish social attitudes using this measure to get more than a third of people saying that they wanted independence, and support for devolution varied, but it was running very often in the high 50s or in the low 60s. And indeed, even the advent of the Scottish government, the SNP becoming into Scottish government in 2007, was not accompanied by any particularly marked increase in support for independence. Indeed, if anything, support for independence tended to be rather lower during those years of minority SNP government before 2011. But then, of course, along came the referendum. Now, it was a referendum which, at the end of the day, the yes side lost, but it was arguably a campaign which the yes side won, because as you can see in the run-up to the 2014 referendum, and the 2014 measure here is before the referendum. So 2015 is our first post-referendum measure. But as you can see, as we've came out of the referendum, we've now been in a position consistently for the last 7 years whereby more people say they are in favour of independence than are in favour of devolution. Though, of course, if you add to those who are in favour of devolution, those who don't want any parliament at all, you still have, and this is what the opinion polls are also saying, a narrow, but only a narrow majority of people in favour of being part of the UK. So the long-term legacy of the independence referendum has been to create a country which, frankly, until the referendum, it looked as though it was a clear majority view for being inside the Union, to a position where it is now consistently a subject that divides the country almost pretty much down the middle. Now, those of you who remember the independence referendum campaign will remember that our politicians spent many hours arguing about whether or not an independent Scotland could or could not be a continuing member of the European Union. It was a bit of a pantomime debate. Those on the yes side said, oh, yes, we can. And those on the no side said, oh no, you can't. You'll have to apply to join from outside, and you'll have to sign up to the euro and all the rest of it. Now, just so to make you realize that politicians do not always have their finger on the pulse, the attitudinal evidence is that this debate was a complete and utter waste of time. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm dividing the Scottish public using a question that gives them lots of options about what Britain's relationship with the European Union should be, but I'm using it to divide people into two. The Eurosceptics are the people who either think that Britain should be outside the EU, or certainly the EU should have fewer powers. The Europhiles are those who are at least happy with the current relationship, or if indeed anything, they might be happy for the European Union to be more powerful. And what I'm showing you for both 2013, 2014, and indeed 2015, the level of support for independence using that measure I've just shown you, separately for Eurosceptics and Europhiles. And the crucial point is there isn't a difference. Yes, the SNP might have been in favour of independence in Europe since around 1990 or so, but there have always been nationalists who say, what's the point of liberating ourselves from London, only to put ourselves into chains with Brussels? And that therefore, actually, this was not an issue that was particularly relevant in the end to whether or not people voted yes or no. Indeed, if we go to the 2016 referendum on Brexit, and we break people up in that referendum according to how they voted in the independence referendum 2 years previously, again, we discover there isn't much difference. Around 3/5 of people who voted yes voted Remain, and around 3/5 of the people who voted no voted Remain. This again was still an issue that did not interact with the independence debate. However, once Brexit was in train, this begins to change. I'll give you 2 slides to show this. First of all, what I'm now doing here is taking that slide I showed you 2 slides ago, but now extending the time series forward through to the most recent reading of 2023. And what you should now notice is that increasingly, as we go from 2016, which is a post-Brexit referendum measure, through 2017, 2019, and now the most recent survey in 2023, increasingly, there is a gap in the level of support for independence between the Europhiles, who are relatively keen on it, and the Eurosceptics, who are not. And now you're looking at a situation where Europhiles on this measure are around twice as likely to support independence as those who don't. Again, using the Scottish Social Attitudes measure. Now, more recently, for the year since 2016, I can also show this for you using measures with which you might find more familiar. So what I'm now showing you is I'm breaking people up according to whether or not they would now vote to be inside the EU or outside the EU. It's either say they would vote to remain in a second referendum, or now it's whether they would vote to rejoin. And for each of these 2 groups, I'm showing you the level of support, the proportion of people who say they would vote yes in another independence referendum, and I've taken out the don't knows, etc. Now, the story again is a very similar one. Not much of a gap in 2016, but as we move towards the more recent surveys, you can see that support for independence, well, actually now it emerges to be about, on this way looking at it, about 3 times higher amongst those people who want to be inside the European Union than those who are outside. So the relationship between Brexit and independence is now quite a strong one, having been entirely absent 10 years ago. So what underlies this? Can we then show that this is reflected to some degree in people's perceptions of what independence might now bring? Now, let me do this in 2 stages. Stage number 1, let's just look at the time series that Scottish Social Attitudes has, in which we're simply asking people, do you think that independence would make Scotland's economy better or worse? Now, the crucial point to note here is that in terms of the balance of opinion, at least, public opinion, when we last measured it a couple of years ago, was still pretty evenly divided, much as was the case for most of the time in the lead up to the 2014 referendum. And other polling evidence out there says that if you simply ask people about the economics of independence, basically the country is divided, and is divided in a not dissimilar way to where it was 10 years ago. It looks as though the debate hasn't changed very much, although what you should note is that people are now much more likely to have a view one way or the other than was the case before 2014. That said, however, if we go on and ask people more or less the same question about the economic consequences of independence, for Brexit, about the economic consequences as we ask about independence, we then discover a notable difference. So again, this is data from 2019 Scottish Social Actives, far left-hand side. Do you think the economy, that Brexit's going to be good or bad for Scotland's economy? Overwhelmingly, people take a negative view. Now, here, when we ask people about the economics of independence, actually a slight proportion of people saying independence might be good for the economy, but it's a much narrower division than it is for Brexit. Equally, Scotland's influence or voice in the world, a feeling that independence will strengthen its voice in the world, but equally that Brexit's going to diminish it. So you can see how perhaps why Brexit might beginning to change people's views. But in particular, of course, what is now true is that if Scotland were to have another referendum while the UK is outside the European Union, that the intellectual question that Scotland would face is a different one from the one it faced in 2014. It would no longer be, do you want to be inside or outside the UK? It would be, do you want to be inside the UK but outside the European Union? Or do you want to be inside the EU or outside the UK? Now, this is not the place to rehearse the arguments, but the point is the arguments are not necessarily going to be the same ones. So one of the things that we did not so long ago was to ask people, not simply about independence being good or bad for various things, but that choice inside the UK but outside the EU versus being inside the EU or outside the UK. The purple bars here are for various phenomena, trade, voice in the world, economy, etc. The proportion of people who think that Scotland would be better off inside the UK but outside the EU. And the green bars are the people who think that the answer is better to be inside the EU, except on the right-hand side, we're talking about risk. So therefore the position is reversed. So people are more likely to think that being inside the UK is risky than people who think about being inside the European Union. Now, so the point to note is, first of all, the balance of opinion when you present people with this question is in favor of being inside the EU, but not the UK. That said, we are still only talking around a half of people choosing that option. And on a lot of these questions, you've got a lot of people in the middle saying, you know what, I'm not sure it's going to make a great deal of difference. And that's something I will come back to. But certainly you can see how now this argument is one where perhaps the independence movement potentially has rather greater support for some of its potential arguments. Now, that said, of course, the choice of being inside the EU but outside the UK raises a number of other issues. It might mean customs checks between the UK, rest of the UK and Scotland. It might mean passport checks, question mark, although, of course, there is a common travel area already still with the Republic of Ireland. And it might well certainly mean that Scotland has to sign up to freedom of movement. Far right-hand side tells you that people are in favour of people from the European Union being able to come to Scotland to live and work. Freedom of movement doesn't seem to be an issue for yes supporters. They think that it will happen and it should happen. More problematic, however, is for the most part, yes supporters, let alone the rest of Scotland, are inclined to the view that they would prefer there not to be customs checks with England or passport checks, though they've got a suspicion on balance, so a lot of people are uncertain that they might. So that's an issue where perhaps the debate could prove to be a more difficult one for the yes side. And the other issue, which certainly isn't resolved, is currency. Yes, supporters would prefer to use the pound rather than the euro, or otherwise use our own currency. And the expectation, even more, is that we'd end up using the pound. This is a debate that still has to be won by the yes side. But finally, as I said, the perception that maybe it won't make much difference is also potentially an important one, because what I invite you to note is that, particularly, for example, if we just take the middle example here on the economy. So 83% of those people who think we'd be better off inside the EU and outside the UK would vote yes, and only 11% of people who take the opposite view would vote yes. But notice that amongst those people who say it wouldn't make much difference, the balance of opinion is actually still for no. And I think the other thing the yes side would have to realize in any future independence debate is that there is still, as it were, the status quo option, and there will always be a tendency for people in Scotland to think, you know what, it isn't going to make much difference, to say, let's just stick with what we know. But anyway, crucial point is that Brexit has changed the character of support for independence, but it has arguably also changed people's attitudes towards some of the central issues that would now arise in independence debate, now that the choice isn't simply about being inside or outside the UK, but rather about being inside the UK but outside the EU versus being inside the EU while being outside the UK. And that different debate does potentially make a difference to a future referendum, depending, of course, on the ability of the two sides to marshal their respective arguments.
Great, thank you very much, John. Fascinating presentation. Let's move straight on to Alex.
Yeah, sure. I'll just try and share my screen now. Okay, so this section of the webinar, let me just check that I've actually shared my screen. 1 second. Okay, great. Should be able to see the slides now. So this section of the webinar is going to cover results from the BSA chapter, which has been published today on national identity, which John and I have co-authored. And from that chapter, I'm going to focus specifically on what we found out regarding attitudes towards national identity, pride, and immigration across Scotland and England. So firstly, let's have a look at how the Scots and English conceptualize their national identities. So Britain is, of course, fairly unusual in being a multinational state. So people are able to have both their British identity as well as identifying as either English, Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish. And what this chart does is it presents results from what is called the Moreno question on national identity. And that asks respondents which of the two national identities available is more important to them. So in England, that would be English versus British, Scotland, Scottish versus British, and the English responses are on the left and the Scottish on the right in this chart. And we can see significant differences in how English and Scottish people respond to this question. The most common response for people in England is that they feel equally English and British. 45% select that option. Whereas the most common response for Scots is that they feel Scottish, not British. And over half of people in Scotland say they either feel Scottish, not British, or more Scottish than British. And that can be seen from the general spread of the results. There's a greater identification with British identity in England than there is in Scotland. Many supporters of Scottish nationalism, including former leaders of the SNP, Humza Yousaf and Nicola Sturgeon, have argued that it is essentially civic in character. And that can be defined in general terms as being both welcoming to those who decide to come to Scotland to live and willing to share sovereignty with other countries as well. So, for example, through EU membership. But one of the questions we ask in the chapter is there any evidence that Scots themselves are essentially more civic when it comes to their own conceptions of national identity? And firstly, we look at the national identity that Scottish and English people may possibly share, i.e. British identity. And this slide shows a proportion of those in England and Scotland who think civic attributes of being British, for example, feeling British, having British citizenship, or respecting British political institutions and laws, are important for being, quote unquote, truly British. And as can be seen, there's little evidence of a greater sense of civic identity here among Scots. English people in general are more likely to think for each metric asked that it is important for being truly British than their Scottish counterparts. And this result is confirmed if we ask a more direct question on civic versus ethnic national identity. And that question is, do you think someone has to be born British to be truly British? That's the ethnocentric conception. Or can someone become British if they make the effort? And that's a civic conception. So what this chart shows is that there's little difference between English and Scottish respondents on this question. Roughly the same proportion are inclined to agree that someone can become British if they make the effort, whereas exactly the same proportion, these figure in the middle, 19%, agree that someone has to be born British to be truly British. Scots are slightly more likely to say they can't choose than English respondents, which we may expect given the lower proportion of Scots who identify as British we saw in the first slide. But what about if we ask Scottish people specifically about their Scottish identity? This graph shows Scottish responses to equivalent questions on their Scottish and British national identities. So in general, Scots think each of the measures are more important for being truly Scottish than they think the equivalent measures are for being truly British. The largest differences are for one of the civic measures, where 3/4 of Scots think feeling Scottish is important for being truly Scottish, compared with 59% who think feeling British is important for being truly British. There's also a similarly large gap on the ethnic measure on the right, where 46% think it is important to have Scottish ancestry to be truly Scottish, compared with only 32% who think it's important to have British ancestry to be truly British. So there's not a great deal of evidence here that Scots have a more civic conception of their Scottish identity. And if we go back to our question, which asks more directly about civic and ethnic conceptions of national identity, we find something interesting here as well. So as shown by the figures on the right, 3 in 10 Scottish respondents agree that one has to be born in Scotland to be truly Scottish. Well, 59% think someone can become truly Scottish if they make the effort. And this 30% figure is higher than the proportion of both English and Scottish respondents who say one has to be born British to be truly British. However, even if there is a greater similarity than may be expected between the Scottish and the English, one may still question how Scottish nationalists in particular conceive of their national identity, and how this compares with both opponents of Scottish nationalism, as well as supporters of a campaign focused around national sovereignty in Britain, namely Brexit. So on the left in this chart, we can see a breakdown of support for civic and ethnic nationalism by those who would vote to rejoin or stay out of the EU. And there's clearly a difference. So those who would rejoin the EU are less likely, only 16% of them, to be primarily ethnic nationalists than those who would not vote to join the EU. That figure is 27%. However, if we look at the breakdown on the right by support for Scottish independence, we see that yes voters are less likely, only 23%, to be primarily ethnic nationalists than are no voters, 38% of them are. And this result is corroborated by other data in the questionnaire. So, for example, 78% of those who support Brexit believe having been born in Britain is important for being truly British, compared with only 45% of those who favour EU membership. Meanwhile, a greater proportion of those who are opposed to independence, 59%, think being born in Scotland is important for being truly Scottish than supporters of independence. Only 50% of those do so. Therefore, although nationalism across the English and Scottish populations might be more similar than expected, Brexit and Scottish independence are clearly still different nationalisms. And this difference in conceptions of nationalism feeds forward into differences in views on policy issues, for example, immigration. And this chart shows the proportion of those who agree with 4 statements on immigration. The 2 statements on the left can be broadly conceived as negative statements on immigration, and the 2 on the right broadly conceived as positive. So as shown in this graph, the greatest proportion of those agreeing with the negative statements towards immigration are leavers. So 57% of leavers think immigrants increase crime rates, and 36% think they take jobs away from people who are born in Britain. Both of these are significantly higher than the proportion of Remainers who agree with these statements. In comparison, opponents of Scottish independence are also more likely to agree with these statements than supporters. Similarly, with the 2 positive statements on the right, a majority of Remainers and Scottish independence supporters think immigrants improve British society by bringing new ideas and cultures, and that they are generally good for Britain's economy. In contrast, only a minority of Brexit supporters and opponents of Scottish independence agree with these 2 positive statements. Just to finish, and turning briefly towards national pride rather than national identity, which is also covered in the chapter. So BSA and SSA also asked a battery of questions on how proud people were of Britain or Scotland across a range of different issues. And this graph compares Scots' responses to the questions on Scotland and English respondents' responses on Britain. There's a fair amount of similarity, so a roughly similar proportion of English people and are proud of the way democracy works in Britain and Britain's achievements in arts and literature, as Scots are proud of the way democracy works in Scotland and Scotland's achievements in the arts. The largest differences are in achievements in sport, where 77% of English people are proud of Britain's achievements, compared with 2/3 of Scots. And in contrast, Scots seem to be prouder of Scotland's history, 78% say they are, than English people are proud of Britain's history. Only 65% say they're proud of Britain's history in England. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Alex. So, as I said at the beginning, the next part of the presentation will be for Leslie Riddick to share her reflections on the findings. So Leslie is a broadcaster, journalist, an author, filmmaker, the list goes on, a podcaster, cyclist, land reform campaigner, and lover of all things Nordic. She's won numerous awards for broadcasting and for her contribution to public life. She has co-presented a weekly podcast for more than a decade. She's also written 5 books, including one about the case for independence, and co-produced or presented 6 films. And she's also co-founder and director of the Scottish think tank Nordic Horizons. So I'll hand over to Leslie for your reflections.
Thanks very much. I mean, even though I had the chapter beforehand, it's actually quite mind-blowing taking all the statistics in. I should say as well, I was brought up in Belfast, born in Wolverhampton, live in Scotland, so make of that what you will. But obviously kind of quite interested then in where culture places you in a lot of this. I mean, there's a lot of, obviously there's a sort of train of thought here, particularly from John's statistics, that suggest that there is a sort of gently rising curve, if you like, on the yes front, which seems to be attached mostly to progressive thinking on many things, including immigration and various outlooks, if you like, that seems to be creating a sort of yes outlook, which is not necessarily then shared by the whole of the rest of the population, perhaps the no outlook. I wonder, and it would be fascinating to know if those attitudes begin to become more and more entrenched because the other side thinks so clearly differently, or where that thinking arises. One thing that struck me quite strongly, I think it was again from John's, was that there, forgive me if it's Alex's, there was one statistic about the kind of civic, it's good to see that sort of civic feeling is there across the whole of Britain, where the strongest feeling about how you characterize being British is that you respect British political institutions, not that ethnicity is the biggest deal. And one of the slides suggested there was 86% support for that across Britain. But if you then look at the question of asking about pride in how British democracy works, you see that it's slumped from 69% to 53%. So then you think, hang on a minute, how is that operating? If you then look at, would you rather be a British citizen than a citizen of anywhere else? You see that has slumped from 62 to 49%. So we've got just about even Stevens on those kind of key metrics of today, how things actually work in Britain. And yet this slightly, you might argue, sort of idealized version of belief in British institutions, which would also be something, obviously being an independent supporter, that yes, would have to work harder at, because there's a gap there that clearly doesn't seem to mesh. On the questions about Brexit, I wonder myself if the reason that the Scots have got, both sides fairly similar for quite a long time, and even subsequent, is that the independence referendum, both sides valorized EU membership. Yes, everybody was saying it was a good thing. The only argument was about whether you could stay in or out. So we had 2 years in Scotland bathed in positivity about the EU. Nobody was really arguing about that. And that's completely different from the rest of the UK. So we then went into 2016 in that Brexit referendum with hardly anybody really saying that the EU membership was a bad thing. And I wonder if that has been a big shaper of Scottish attitudes, because that seemed to be almost, if you like, a settled will that came out of the Scottish referendum into the Brexit one. And it's interesting too, though, how some of that's tapering off now. And I noticed some of John's statistics, I think, went as far as 2021. And when you start looking post 2021, there's slightly less positivity about, well, independence and the EU membership. And it would be interesting to know where we're going with that, because 2021 was also a period that mapped the highest returns, if you like, for independence. Ironically, at a time of COVID, but people felt that Nicola Sturgeon made a good job of managing that. And I wonder then if sometimes things which seem not directly related at all, which might be that perception of just good management, actually start to boost everything that's then associated with that cause. So anyway, that's just some very quick thoughts.
Thank you, Letty. So I think, so first off, John and Alex, do you want to respond to Leslie's points? And also a reminder to the audience, do put your questions in the Q&A and we'll open up shortly.
John, you're on mute. Sorry. I think they were mostly towards your side of the presentation as well. So,
Well, okay, right, fine. All right.
Well.
I'll suggest you pick up some of the comments about pride in a moment. Let me pick up two things. Have attitudes become more entrenched? I think the answer to that question is yes, because of course, before 2014, Scotland's constitutional status was something that we debated, but not something that the general population had to nail its colours to the mast on by putting X on the ballot paper. The 2014 independence referendum, of course, forced people to make that choice, and 85% of people responded to that choice. So you are now talking about a society in which people have got, they committed themselves once, so therefore it's arguably more difficult to change. That said, however, what we also know, and we know what's been underlying one of the reasons why support for Brexit and support for independence are now linked with each other, is that certainly in the wake of the 2016 referendum, you did find, as the yes side anticipated, that some of the people who had voted no and remain switched to yes, but equally some of the people who voted yes and leave switched in the opposite direction. It's just that in the longer run, because the first group is more numerous than the second group, that the movements haven't simply cancelled out, but they have left us in this situation where support for independence is not wildly above what it was in 2014, but it's tending to run at the 48-49% mark. But the point is, there have been countervailing forces here as a result of Brexit, but the result is certainly a different structure. And it's an interesting observation, as you say, that perhaps indeed that is one of the consequences of the character of but it's a consequence of both the character of the debate in 2014 and then the outcome in 2016. But you have to have the two things together for them to get intertwined. The second point I'll respond to is about good management. Well, actually, the date on this, I think the real year, Leslie, that support for independence for the first time was consistently running above the 50% mark, was in the second half of 2020. It was during the height of the COVID pandemic, when the perception was that Nicola Sturgeon was handling the thing reasonably well and knew what she was talking about, and that the same was not necessarily true of Boris Johnson in 10 Downing Street. And that, it wasn't a large number of people, but you had a minority of people who had voted no, who said, you know what, actually, I think we might have managed this a wee bit better if we'd done so on our own. That, however, did disappear in the first half of 2021. And by the time we got to the Holyrood election, it had largely gone. But in a sense, the good news for the independence movement is that actually, in the end, it looks as though support for independence doesn't simply rest on perceptions of good management for the SNP, because the other side of the story now is, the SNP as an institution is nothing like as highly regarded as it once was, including not least its stewardship of things like the public service in Scotland. But that has not affected the level of support for independence, which is still running at just below 50%. So although, as it were, the chief cheerleader for independence is currently somewhat held beneath the waterline as an institution, it doesn't seem to have affected people's attitudes more broadly, which in a sense fits your suggestion, Leslie, that attitudes are in some senses entrenched, and that certainly the issue of independence isn't simply a question of people's perceptions of how well they're being governed by the SNP, and that, you know, there are bigger issues at stake here, including now the issues that have been raised by the fact that Brexit's changed the question that Scotland faced. And, you know, the travails of the SNP in the last 2 years have not changed people's views about Brexit. Alex, why don't you want to talk about pride and the sources of pride, which got quite a lot of coverage in the, at least on in the English media this morning.
Yeah, sure. So just to pick up on Leslie's point, because you highlighted there that we've seen a decline in pride in the way democracy works, and we've also seen a decline in a whole battery of different measures of which we can measure national pride. One of the ones that particularly got media attention today is that there's been a very sharp decline in pride in British history. That's dropped by 22 percentage points. So there's some of those measures of national pride that are maybe more open to persuasion from current affairs. So, for example, we ask about economic achievements as well. So the way the economy is doing is obviously going to influence that. It was very low in the 90s, and it's now returned to that low base. Similarly, the way democracy works, there's been a lot of constitutional crises over the previous decade that may have fed into a decline in pride in that issue in Britain. I think it's interesting, and it's one of the things that I highlighted in the last slide, that although pride in Britain's history has declined by quite a significant amount over the past decade, we asked this question for the first time about Scottish history, and there's still a fair amount of pride in Scotland's history. You know, it holds at about 80%, which is what it used to be, you know, between 1995 and 2013. For Britain's history. So the way those debates we've had in recent years about Britain's history and a reevaluation of it has obviously played out in a slightly different way in England and Scotland.
Can I come back for just a second? I wasn't actually asking about history, although I'd imagine that the British pride thing has been dented very substantially by the slavery issue.
Yeah, sure.
A lot more traction south of the border, although, hey, you know, obviously we're not immune here. But I was asking actually about the key metric that you've picked out of a civic kind of nature of citizenship,
right,
which was reflected by 86% of people, I think, across Britain, saying respecting British political institutions was what essentially made you British, is not reflected then in pride in how British democracy works. So never park the history. I'm talking about people just, you know, on the one hand saying you've got to respect British political institutions to be British, and then on the other hand, when you say to them, "Aye, and how well's it doing?" they kind of go, "Not well, actually."
Sure. I mean, I guess the point is, Leslie, is that people are saying, look, you know, you should have a commitment to this country, and a commitment to this country is, you know, accepting the way we are governed. That doesn't necessarily stop people. I mean, you know, we came out with more material from British social activists during the election campaign, which the Prime Minister has picked up, that, you know, levels of trust in politics and our politicians is on the low side. The point is, you may feel that people should feel committed to this country, in this instance, this country being Britain, without necessarily at the same time saying, but you know what, we're having a wee bit of bother as a country in terms of how we're being governed and how our economy is going. And in a sense, you know, that in a sense is reflecting, you know, a broader zeitgeist that was very clearly displayed in the election.
Okay, shall we move on to a few questions from the audience? There's a couple of questions around the impact of the Labour government. So how does Labour's success in the recent generation in Scotland reconcile with sustained high support for independence in the surveys? And another question about Keir Starmer with his emphasis on national pride and so on, and what are the implications of this for English devolution?
Okay, well, let's pick up the first one first. The short answer is that there is now, I mean, whereas by 2021, we'd reached a situation whereby something like 85% of yes supporters were voting for the SNP, and less than 10% of no supporters were voting for the SNP. And Scotland's politics had became like politics in Northern Ireland. It was being dominated by the constitutional question in a way that was not true a decade ago. I mean, when the SNP got its overall majority in 2011, about 40% of people who were opposed to independence at that point in time voted for the SNP. Those days are over. So the SNP can no longer get support from unionist voters, so anything other than small numbers. But because of the SNP's political difficulties, you've got a minority of people who say they still vote yes, who were switching to other parties. Some of them were voting for the Greens or for Alva, but Labour also clearly picked some up. So I think that's the crucial point I was making earlier. There is now at the moment a clear distinction between people's evaluations of the SNP as a political movement and the argument about the constitutional question. And, you know, a minority, but it is only a minority, of those who voted Labour in July are supporters of independence. And we'll see how that plays out during the course of the next 2 years. I mean, more broadly, I mean, you know, it has been interesting the way in which the Prime Minister has picked up more broadly what we were saying during the, you know, one of the headlines we said in election campaign is, look, it's all fine and dandy for all you politicians to be running off and saying that you're promising this, that, and the other. But the honest truth is that the public are pretty doubtful about whether they believe any of you. And that certainly does seem to be being picked up by the Prime Minister, and he seems to accept that there is an issue of trust in politics and politicians. Now, this is at the GB level, so we don't have the same deep measures for Scotland. And that, you know, that again, the lack of pride then just becomes part of that. But the question is whether or not Labour will succeed. Now, my only comment I would make about where Labour are at the moment is that, you know, one of the first rules about trust in politics is be very, very careful what you promise, and be very, very careful about setting yourself up as being holier than thou. And we are already seeing journalists, quite rightly, ferreting around trying to find stories whereby, you know what, we're not quite sure why that person who contributed to the Labour Party in the past, or who was previously worked for a Labour think tank, suddenly seems to have got promoted into a civil service job. And that, in a sense, is the counterpoint. If you set yourself up as a politician to be saying, I'm going to improve trust, we're going to be honest and straightforward with people, don't be surprised that people then start looking for examples of where that is not true. I mean, you know, Tony Blair had the same problem. Tony Blair, in the wake of the whole arguments about sleaze with the Conservative government of 92 to 97, set himself up and saying, you know, we are going to be whiter than white. And then when there were some debates about his relationship with the then owner of Formula One, you know, he had to do a big interview to say, look, you know, trust me, I'm really an honest bloke. So we'll wait and see how it plays out. But to be honest, if you're wanting to improve trust, you're probably wise not to promise to improve it, rather to get around to doing the things like providing stable government, improving public services, and improving the economy that might actually succeed in improving it, and perhaps claiming the credit when you succeed. But don't try to set yourself up for it beforehand.
Thank you. We've got one more sort of methodological question. So Scottish respondents were asked about Scotland, but English respondents were asked about Britain. Would it be more consistent to ask both sets about Britain?
I come in on that one. We did. So we asked everyone in Britain about Britain, and we asked Scotland some additional questions on Scottish identity as well. So just to recap briefly, the first part of my presentation, basically we were looking at Scots and English respondents to those Scots and English people's responses to those specific questions about British identity, and we actually found that if you compare, you know, English conceptions of national identity with Scottish people's identity in terms of the civic ethnic dichotomy, there's not that great a deal of a difference in terms of those two populations. So yeah, we did look at British identity with both Scottish and English respondents.
Yeah, we should say this is part of a broader international project. So eventually it's going to be possible to compare Scots conceptions of both British and Scottish identity with, you know, the perception. You'll love this, Leslie. You'll be able to compare it with Swedish conceptions, Norwegian conceptions, Finnish conceptions, etc., because they're all got people who are part of this international project. But that does, to some degree, constrain the design. So because it's part of an international project, we had to ask everybody across Great Britain about British identity, and we then added questions additional to the project about Scotland. What in an ideal world we would have done, but we couldn't do, was also to ask people in England about English identity. But that's in a sense is the missing bit in our jigsaw. But that's one of the constraints of the project that we were operating under.
Well, it would be fascinating to see with those Nordic countries how they feel about being Nordic as well as their own country. And then for those who are members of the EU, how European they feel, because that obviously varies massively.
Sure.
Can I just come back? Here I am daring to kind of just critique a little bit of John's thing. When you were talking about Scotland becoming a bit more like Northern Ireland, and that it's kind of got very entrenched sides. I mean, it sort of goes without saying, but as someone who's lived in both, it does on the ground feel very different in that you know, the vote is not predictable by religion or ethnic background to the same degree.
Yes.
Which is
no, but the point I'm making, Leslie, however, is that vote could be predicted by 2021. Vote in Scotland could be predicted by people's constitutional preference to the same degree as it could in Northern Ireland. I grant you there are other attributes for which it is not true, but it also meant you've got this situation where in the end, people in Northern Ireland do not, for the most part, vote on the basis of how well the public services are operating in Northern Ireland. And, you know, the eternal problem the opposition had up here was it looked as though criticisms of the Scottish government's record was also like water off a duck's back. That's one of the things that's changed in the last couple of years, is that now people's views about how well Scotland is being run do now seem to be factoring into their voting decisions in a way that wasn't proven to be the case, and which still tends not to be true in Northern Ireland.
Okay, I've got one question, which is just a clarification, really. So a question, do you separate out those who might see independence as an ideal or final destination if the conditions are right, as opposed to those who want it now at any cost? So I think that's clarification of the question, I think.
Short answer, no.
What would happen if you did? Have you done that in previous ones, John?
No, to be honest, it's not something we've pursued.
Because I do wonder, just doesn't exactly help my side here, but if the actual likelihood of independence happening seems to have receded because there isn't an obvious route now that the Supreme Court's made its ruling, and there's two governments which, you know, to my mind, shamefully, a Labour government won't allow that vote. But still, if it looks like the door is bolted, and that in a way was something also that came up in some of your earlier statistics, where you saw the move towards independence, as soon as there was a means of achieving it, it began to move. When the SNP was first elected, they still had that on the can, but it didn't shift immediately. No. So it looks like cometh the opportunity, cometh the support a little bit, and perhaps the converse is true, so that people might feel safer to vote for or say they're pro-independence because they don't expect it to be happening tomorrow.
Well, you know, at the end of the day, Leslie, if you kind of go through the polling data, sure, you can discover, if you ask people whether or not when a referendum should be held, there is a degree of reticence amongst yes voters. Not all yes voters necessarily want the referendum to happen tomorrow. Now, of course, there are two possible explanations for that. One is that perhaps they're not quite sure they would win, and the other is that, you know, perhaps you know, it's an Augustinian approach, and, you know, yes, we want it, but not necessarily now. That said, once you start asking people in principle, or indeed ask people whether or not there should be a referendum within 5 years, you basically discover that people who are in favour of independence say, yes, we should have one. And people who are opposed to independence say they don't. So I'm always somewhat reticent about this argument. I mean, in the end, of course, now, I mean, where the debate's going to go on, and again, we're going to see this played out today with the finance minister's statement. There is now very, very clearly going to be a debate about what are the implications of a UK Labour government for the independence debate. Now, there are those, of course, on the Labour side who say, well, look, Labour will turn around the UK economy. They will provide good government. They will be more, they will have a better, have an ear that's better attuned to Scotland's needs and aspirations than the previous administration, and that therefore support for independence will fall away. And indeed, the supposed less importance of independence will become more manifest. The other narrative, potential narrative, of course, is that the UK Labour government will not succeed in turning things around anytime soon. It's a government with a very narrow electoral base already. Its parliamentary majority is way ahead of its support in the electorate, and that by 2026 the SNP will be saying, you tried the Tories, you tried Labour, neither of them are the fix, and that the debates changed. Now that's going to be partly a question of what happens on both sides of the border, and also a crucial argument about framing and which of the two sides can come up with the better arguments. And again, as with the broader argument about independence, I think the other thing I would say about the independence question at the moment is that Nicola Sturgeon's biggest failure, in my view, in her last months as First Minister was to fail to get the independence debate restarted in the post-COVID environment. Right, the government was hoping to do that with its various white papers. It did not succeed, and so at the end of the day, what I think we need to realise is that we've not really had the debate about whether or not independence would be good or bad for Scotland in a post-Brexit environment, because it involves quite difficult questions. You have to decide which do you think will you be better off in, a part of the relatively small but more highly integrated single market that is the United Kingdom, or part of the much bigger but less highly integrated but increasingly more integrated single market of the European Union. Answers, please, on two sides of A4, right? We've not as yet really had that debate. And until we have that debate, we won't really know where Scots stand. The point is, the no side don't want to have a debate because they want to hang on to the union, quite understandably. The yes side do need a debate, but they failed to start it in the dying days of Nicola Sturgeon. And since, because of the SNP's political difficulties, they're not in a position to start the debate. So again, it gets us back to the fact that until the SNP are able to restore their political reputation, which is a not inconsiderable problem, that, in the end of the day, is the reason why independence is off the agenda. I mean, the other reason why independence is off the agenda, and we should acknowledge this. This is the one signal achievement of Liz Truss's tenure as Prime Minister, because the realpolitik of the last Parliament always was, to get the arguments about whether or not you're going to run the SNP were going to regard the elections as a de facto referendum or not. That was a complete waste of time, not least because I've already suggested Scots were already tending to use elections as de facto referendums anyway. The realpolitik has always been, would you end up with a hung parliament in which at some point the SNP might have the leverage that basically you faced a Labour Prime Minister with the choice of either being forced to go to the country at a time when they might lose an election or accepting an independence referendum. The point is that what Liz Truss did was to open up the prospect of a majority Labour government, and that is the moment when independence fell off the agenda. And that's Liz Truss's signal achievement as Prime Minister.
Okay, probably just take a couple more questions. Here's a more straightforward one. Have there been changes in attitudes and identity amongst younger age groups over the past decade? Have we looked at age groups separately?
Yes, the short answer is that younger people are more in favour of independence than older people. The gradient's not changed that much in the last 10 years. It's just that that's a very consistent trend. And it does mean in the long run, but I emphasize long run, that unless those on the union side of the argument do start to convince at least middle-aged people of the virtues of the union, then support for the union could decline in the long run. But it's partly a question here of to what extent is this relationship a generational cohort effect, which there's some reason to believe that it is, but it may also be partly a life cycle effect, i.e., is it the case that when you get into your 50s, you start worrying about who will pay your pension?
Okay. And perhaps a final question. What does the data suggest about the developing polarisation between differing political views in Scotland? Are we getting further apart and more entrenched in our views?
Well, I guess I refer you to the answer earlier. I mean, we are not as polarized on the constitutional question at the moment politically as we were 2 years ago or 3 years ago, insofar as those on the yes side of the argument have now scattered their favors more broadly, including some of them voting for unionist parties. That said, on the no, this is an asymmetric story. There are very few people who are in favour of remaining inside the UK who are willing to vote for the SNP. Whereas again, if you go back 10 years ago, people who were in favour of Scotland remaining inside the UK were willing to vote for the SNP on the grounds that they thought the SNP would be more effective at standing up for Scotland's interests within the framework of the UK. They're no longer willing to do that. And to that extent, at least, the constitutional question still matters more than it once did. But, you know, on the yes side at the moment, yeah, not everybody's, the situation is not as polarized as it was.
Is there a tiny second to just ask, though, to pin it down a wee bit more, though? What both of your slides showed, I thought, was that the yes side seemed to have now got collected characteristics which are quite different, in a sense, from either Brexit voters or no voters in Scotland. So that there's there's polarization on who you'll vote for, but in a deeper way, there might be more polarization on who you regard as being a legitimate Scot, how you feel about immigration. You know, quite a number of things like that look like they're kind of splitting across the side.
But one of the other things, again, that Alex and I have written about in the past is the way in which, in particular, attitudes towards independence have become, again, this is also part of the Brexit story as well. Attitudes towards independence now. People who you would call social liberals, so people who are relatively relaxed about immigration, tend to be in favor of gay rights, etc., etc. The people who hold that views, that they are now more likely to be in favor of independence than those who are in favor of the union, and that's something again that's emerged in the course of the last 10 years. So yeah, it tells you about something about the character of the argument that is used by many of those who back independence. It also helps to explain why there was something of a fairly visceral reaction towards some of Kate Forbes's comments, who, of course, while she's a strong supporter of independence, doesn't necessarily reflect the social liberal views of many of those who are inside the nationalist movement.
Okay, well, we're at 11 o'clock, so unfortunately going to have to draw this discussion to a close. I feel this could have carried on much longer, but just remains me to thank our speakers, John and Alex, for their excellent presentations. Thank you, Leslie, for your very thought-provoking reflections. And last but not least, thank you for the audience for taking the time to attend this event and for your questions and your interest in this presentation. Goodbye.